and then I'm going to share the screen, and I'm going to show you a slide, especially for those of you who are new to this presentation. And so I want you to understand about these handouts. These are designed for you to read much of it on your own. This may be the longest handout I have ever prepared. And so I want you to be aware that I'm not going to be reading all of this aloud. I'm going to read plenty of it, but these are designed for you to read much of this on your own. Here are the sections in the handout. On the front page, you have what is the point at the very beginning. And then you have on the left, why is this book worth our time? And then for a number of pages, these are the best of Randy's highlighted passages. When I went through this book, I read on the Kindle app, there is a limit to how many highlights they will let me transfer into the place where I can copy and paste. And I exceeded that limit the most I've ever exceeded the limit on any book I've read. So there are a lot of excerpts here, highlighted passages. When you get to the end of that section, it's actually on page 11. Then in this left column in the dark box, that is kind of the thesis of the book. And it is in the words of the author. And then you're going to find a bunch of key points and lessons and stories and a little bit about the author. And then at the very end, you'll have my lessons and takeaways. And in the last section of the book, when you see something in italics, that means it's also a direct excerpt from the book. So these handouts are very thorough. I work diligently on them, and then I have a wonderful design person who makes them look better than I could ever do. So I wanted you to be aware of the handout. And now I've already begun the video recording. I'm going to begin an audio recording, and we will begin. Let me start by saying that there is a real dispute in this country on whether or not there is something called systemic racism. And this book argues that that is very real, though he doesn't necessarily like the phrase, but he definitely agrees that systemic racism is very real. I'm having people, I'm doing books on race issues at my business gathering, First Friday Book Synopsis, and I'm having people send me authors and they want me to do their books. And these are authors, African-American authors, who would not necessarily agree. In fact, they do not agree with Ibram X. Kendi and some of the other authors that I have selected. And I've read a couple of those books. I have chosen not to present them at this point, but I'm going to summarize in a moment, or in just a brief moment, what the differences are. These books do not argue, and this is important to understand. These books do not argue that African American people should not take personal responsibility. They argue that African Americans should, in fact, take personal responsibility. But these books that I'm presenting also describe a policy world, a societal world, a cultural world, a systemic world that is racist. And so these books say personal responsibility, yes, but there are other problems, and even the problems that might be solved by that are societal and widespread. I am in agreement with that view. I do not believe that someone taking personal responsibility, that message will bring enough people out of poverty, out of difficulty. That's my own view. And so I've chosen not to do those books. at the Urban Engagement Book Club, which we've had going on for at least 15 years, I actually once did present a book that made that case. I'm going to tell you the author's name. This came out before the controversy otherwise about the author, and the author was Bill Cosby. And Bill Cosby very much argued that each individual should take personal responsibility, and the problem is not societal. That was pretty much the argument in his book. I won't make any observations about Bill Cosby's personal failures on personal responsibility, but I wanted to acknowledge this difference. And we are right now in the middle of a political season where there is an entire party that is using this language publicly. There is no systemic racism. I disagree with that. And the books that I'm reading verify that. So that's the background. Now, if you will look at the front page, like always, I'm going to be jumping around a little. The book is called How to Be an Anti-Racist. This is the second major book by Ibram X. Kendi. And Ibram X. Kendi is a careful researcher and an academician, and you've seen him on television probably being interviewed a few times in the last few months. And his first book, Stamped from the Beginning, was taken from an excerpt of a speech by Senator Jefferson Davis, who became the president of the Confederate States of America. And that quote is a quote that says that the Negro, and when you hear me use the word Negro today, it is because the word was used by Jefferson Davis and in a couple of other instances, that the Negro's place in the universe is that of being inferior to the white person, and he is to be a slave as he was stamped from the beginning. Those are the exact words of Jefferson Davis. In, I think it was 1860, he was a senator before the Civil War. And so that book is more of the history. This book has plenty of the history, but this book now says this is what needs to be done. And what needs to be done is people, obviously it's wrong if they are racist, and it is also wrong, and this is, if you want to write this down in the margin, but it's throughout the handout, it is also wrong if they are non-racist. So it's wrong to be a racist. It is practically equally as wrong to be a non-racist. The only stance one should take, according to this book, is how to be an anti-racist. So it's important that you understand that that's what's in the book. All right, on the front page, what is the point? In addition to the actual harm of overt racism, people who lynch people, people who attack people, people who bomb churches, the ongoing danger comes from non-racists who, by their silence, circle these phrases, by their silence and lack of activism, they help perpetuate a racist society. So that's the point of this book. On the left, why is this book worth our time? Well, number one, this book is another candid, heart-wrenching look at the overt racism in our past as a country, including the racism of our elected, influential officials and leaders. Number two, this book is a painful reminder that policies are enacted and protected that perpetuate the racism in our society. So we establish policies, we protect those policies, and they continue to impact racism. It's really hard to not bring current news in. But a while back, not terribly long ago, the citizens of the state of Florida voted in an overwhelming majority, 65%. And they said in that vote, this was a referendum in the state, that formerly incarcerated people should be given the right to vote after they have served their punishment. And most of those, a vast majority, a significant majority, are African American. And it passed. And so people assumed in Florida that people who got out of prison would be able to vote. But it turns out that because of the wording of the law, the federal court has just decided, last week I think it was, that until they pay every dollar of restitution, every dollar of court fee, every dollar that they owe for whatever charge from the courts, they will not be allowed to vote. In other words, they haven't really served their sentence until all the dollars are paid. Those who believe in the right to vote for everyone are calling that a modern day version of a poll tax. Well, that's an example of policy that is impacting one race greater than others, a racist policy. Number three, this book is a clear call to be an anti-racist. It provides strategies and a touch of motivation to keep fighting the anti-racist battle. So that's the quick point about the point of the book and why it's worth our time. Now turn all the way to page 11, near the back of the handout. And this is after the highlights. I've got more pages of highlights than usual. We'll go back and look at a few. But now we're at the part where I talk about the stories, etc. On the right, who is Ibram X. Kendi? And what is this book? Well, this book is basically a memoir, and it's really kind of almost a unique style because it's a memoir of his personal evolution in thought and in training. He was a bad student in high school. He was not a good student in his early days of college. Let me pause and say that I had a very high grade point average in my graduate degree. But I did not have, let me just say, it's a miracle I was allowed to stay in school in my early years of my undergraduate degree. So I kind of resonated with him. He was not a good student early on, but he became a good student, ended up earning a doctorate, and is now a professor. And then not only is it his personal evolution in his thinking and his training, his work ethic, but also the book is overlaid with remarkable scholarship. Some of the quotes in this book from the past will turn your stomach. He is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor in the Humanities at Boston University, the founding director of the Boston University Center for Anti-Racist Research, a contributing writer for The Atlantic, and a CBS News correspondent. In July 2020, he assumed the position of director of the Center for Anti-Racist Research at Boston University, and his work in Boston is a continuation of his work at the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center at the American University. So he really has immersed himself in research in anti-racism and in the racism of the past. The third bullet point here is he is also a cancer survivor. He's a young man, but he nearly died of cancer. And that was, he was diagnosed with the cancer right after his wife ended up being in remission from her cancer. She's a medical doctor, he's a professor. They both nearly died from cancer. That's quite a piece of this story. All right, prelude. I'm on page 11. Why I try to simply let the books speak. I spent 20 years of my life doing something called expository preaching. I was a preacher, and my goal in life in those days was to read the Bible, understand the Bible, and say what the Bible said in my sermons. I'm kind of long away from that, but the concept and the discipline and the approach is the same. And a line that jumped out at me in the book is, Kendi said, if only I'd spent more time listening to Martin Luther King, listening to King, instead of all the adults who claimed to speak for him. And my recommendation is that you ought to reread once a year or so the I Have a Dream speech. Read it. Don't listen to it. Read it. And then read the letter from Birmingham jail by Dr. King. And then read his Nobel Peace Prize speech. Look for the actual words of Dr. King in their context. And if you can begin to hear the message of Dr. King from his own words, that's a better thing to do than to just listen to what people said about Dr. King. And as I read that portion, I kind of thought about the regular apology people give. This has happened within the last month with at least 3 or 4 elected officials. And they'll be caught on Facebook or on Twitter or in some recording at a meeting, and they'll say something outrageously, overtly racist. And then they will say, now that they're caught, quote, that's not who I am. And my comment is, that's exactly who they are. If it comes out, that's who you are. And so those are some thoughts about paying attention to the words you say, the words you hear, the words you read. And my goal in these presentations is to let the book speak. A second prelude is that as you look around you, here's a question. What shall we do with all of these different people around us? I'm being very blunt. There are stories in this book from the past and a few from the present that basically describe a white person, almost always a white person, but not exclusively, looking at a black person and other groups, and in one way or another, they are communicating to themselves and by their behaviors and subtleties and maybe overt actions, you don't belong here. You're a lesser person. You're maybe not a full person. Remember that our Constitution once defined a black person as 3/5 of a person. And one of the things that this book is saying, and there are chapters on black people and Native Americans and queer people, it is a very inclusive look. One of the things this book says very clearly is we're not going to be the society we need to be until every kind of person is viewed as a person and not representative of a group. I'll try to remember to say some more about that in a few minutes. All right, some stories at the bottom of page 11. The real starting point in this country is described with this little quote from Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson suspected a decade after declaring white American independence, the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowments both of body and mind. White supremacy is in the DNA of this country. This book argues that, his earlier book argued that, and it is impossible, in my view, to have a different view of that if you read the actual history. Here is the next quote. This is from Enlightenment philosopher David Hume, 1753. Think about that designation. He's enlightened. He's an Enlightenment philosopher. I am apt to suspect the Negroes and in general all the other species of men, for there are 4 or 5 different kinds, to be naturally inferior to the whites. There never was a civilized nation of any other complexion than white. Such a uniform and constant difference could not happen in so many countries and ages if nature had not made an original distinction between these breeds of men. David Hume declared that all races are created unequal. Wow. So that's an Enlightenment philosopher. That's Thomas Jefferson, who is the man who coined, who wrote, "But we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, but not the black men." And then you have another quote from Jefferson Davis, the senator who became the president of the Confederate States of America. America was founded by white men for white men. He said that on the floor of the U.S. Senate in 1860. Turn to page 12. This is a remarkable story. It's relatively early in the book, and now I have to give you a little history. I was at Abilene Christian College, that's what it was called then, from 1968 to 1972. And I was training for ministry. And I remember a graduate student who introduced me to a preacher who introduced me to a publishing company called InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, InterVarsity Press. And it was kind of the liberal, progressive Christian press of the era. Haven't read anything from them in years. And I do remember this. I did not get to go, but I remember it being talked about by kind of, if I can use the phrase, some of the progressive students on campus. They had a conference in Urbana, Illinois in 1970. It was called the Urbana 70, put on by the InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. And on the last day of the conference, they kind of gave it over to the African Americans, to the Black Christians. And there was a very fiery, I remember reading a book by this guy, preacher named Tom Skinner. And Tom Skinner ended the Black Day of preaching and music by quoting from Luke chapter 4. And he ended up that quote by saying, quote, "The liberator has come." And what he did was he described Jesus as the person from God who arrived to bring liberation to the captives. That's in Luke 4, quoted from what Christians call the Old Testament, one of the prophets. And so I'm quoting here from the book, it's in italics. At Urbana 70, Ma and Dad found themselves leaving the civilizing and conserving and racist church they realized they'd been a part of. They were saved into Black liberation theology and joined the churchless church of the Black Power movement. They stopped thinking about saving Black people and started thinking about liberating Black people. And what he says in the book is that his parents were Christian. By the way, I'm skipping some human interest stories. For example, his mom and dad both went to that conference, but did not know each other. They met each other later, they married later, but they had come from the same roots within the Christian Black liberation movement. And what Ibram X. Kendi, by the way, that was not his birth name, Ibram X. Kendi basically said, I bought their ideas, but from a secular perspective. And so Ibram X. Kendi is not making any of these arguments from a Bible perspective or a Christian perspective, but that's where he came from. All right. And then he tells a story. I call this young Ibram. That wasn't his name then. And he was in a class. I forget the grade, but it was elementary school, late elementary school. And he was sitting near the back, and it was mostly white children with just a couple of black children. And there was a question asked by the teacher, and a little shy black girl student raised her hand to give the answer. And the teacher totally ignored her completely until a white person raised their hand a little bit later, and the teacher called on that person. Well, young Ibram X. Kendi basically raised Cain. He wouldn't get up from his seat. The teacher said, why? He said, I'm not going to tell you. And he created something of a problem. I'm going to read now from the handout. The girl who was humiliated and the boy who tried to stand up for her. And Ibram X. Kendi says that it is common to call that kind of experience a microaggression. A microaggression. And then a direct quote from the book. A persistent daily low hum of racist abuse is not minor. I use the term abuse because aggression is not as exacting a term. And what he argues in the book is that when you have that happen over and over again, when a child is not called on, when a child is belittled in a mixed classroom, when a black man is pulled over for driving while black, when you put all of those together, then you end up with a self-esteem issue. You end up with I'm not as good as, and the people using the power say I'm better than, and that's what it is. And then I've got a bullet point here on the uneven playing field. It makes anti-racist sense to talk about the personal irresponsibility of individuals like me of all races. I screwed up. These are his words. I could have studied harder. But some of my white friends could have studied harder too, and their failures and irresponsibility didn't somehow tarnish their race. Now, this is really important. There is a tendency for white people to say that black people don't study in school well enough. They don't work hard to learn. Lesser students. They don't accomplish as much. And so they're accused of that problem because they're black. And what Kendi is saying is, I know some white students that weren't very good. And you're looking at one. I wasn't a very good student. But nobody said, oh, Randy Caillou, European French name, isn't a very good student. All white people are lazy. And I think that's really important to understand, is that judgment was passed on an entire group. And so he said, I should be critiqued as a student. I was undermotivated and distracted and undisciplined. In other words, a bad student, but I shouldn't be critiqued as a bad black student. Now put a star beside that. I presented a book a while back on anti-Semitism. And this is the same principle. It is okay to say this person has this trait that is a personal trait that I find offensive. But when you put in front of that person's name, that person is a Jewish blank or a black blank, when you add that qualifier, you're being racist and judgmental and unfair toward a group of people. That's what he argues in this book. So here are the options. You can be racist. You can claim to be non-racist, or you can be anti-racist. A key point, definitions matter. I'm continuing to read on the handout. Definitions anchor us in principles. This is not a light point. If we don't do the basic work of defining the kind of people we want to be in language that is stable and consistent, we can't work towards stable, consistent goals. Racism is a marriage of racist policies and racist ideas that produces and normalizes racial inequities. Circle that. Racial inequity. Racial inequity is when two or more racial groups are not standing on approximately equal footing. Here's an example, this is from the book, of racial inequity. 71% of white families lived in owner-occupied homes in 2014, compared to 45% of Latinx families and 41% of Black families. We can unknowingly strive to be a racist. We can knowingly strive to be anti-racist. Now, I've got Exhibit A. I talked about this at the latest First Friday book synopsis. I've got Exhibit A on this kind of racism in our own area. In South Dallas, in the backyard of a woman, after 2 years of pleading, they have finally started taking down Shingle Mountain. You have not seen the news in Dallas about Shingle Mountain, a mountain of shingles, toxic to breathe, the debris blowing into people's noses and mouths and houses. And that Shingle Mountain, there illegally, was left there for 2 years, and it is still there, although they're beginning, I believe, to get rid of it. In the backyard of an African-American woman and an African-American neighborhood. Let me just ask, how long do you think the people in Highland Park would have let a Shingle Mountain stay in Highland Park? And the answer is not for 10 seconds. And so that's an idea of the racism in the society. All right, now, this book spends a lot of time honoring and learning from W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the African-American writer from about a little over a century ago, give or take. And I'm reading now The Duality. Du Bois wished to be both a Negro and an American. Du Bois wished to inhabit opposing constructs. To be American is to be white. To be white is to not be a Negro. One ever feels his two-ness. That's a famous quote from Du Bois. Du Bois explained an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. Now, about racists. You have to listen to what I'm about to say carefully. He says it is pretty easy to spot racism in white people. It's real, it's present, some of it is overt, Some of it is behind the surface. They call themselves the non-racists, but they ultimately believe that there is privilege, there is something better for white people. They belong in a position higher than black people. White privilege is very real. But he says there are also black people who are racist. And it's not that they're racist against white people in his book. That may be another discussion for another book. But in this book, he says there are black people who are racist against other black people. They basically say to themselves and to their circle, I am better than that black person. And he quotes the N-word being used in a comedy routine by Chris Rock, who said there's a difference between a black person and a blank. And Chris Rock later regretted that comedy routine. But the idea is that black people who arrive at a certain position and end up looking down on other black people. And that's what he's talking about. And then he says about systemic racism. And this is a great example. So put a star beside this. There were two kinds of racism in Birmingham. And in the way investigators can figure out exactly who those church bombers were, that's overt racism. If you don't remember the story, there was a church bombing in Birmingham. Little girls were killed. That was done by white supremacists, and they wanted to hurt the black church, the black community, and they were willing to kill black kids to do it. He said, you can investigate that. You can come up with their name. You can prosecute it. That's overt racism. But in the same way that investigators can figure that out, investigators, this is from the book, can figure out exactly what policies caused 500 black babies to die each year at a much higher rate than white babies, and who put those policies in place. Racism has its tentacles everywhere. Do nothing climate change is racist policy. Shingle Mountain is racist policy. The fact that more black people and more Hispanic people are coming down with COVID-19, that's not in the book, but that is racist policy. So that's the reality. And he says there are a lot of people who believe that an approach is assimilationism. And assimilationist ideas, he says, are racist ideas. Assimilationist ideas and segregationist ideas are the two types of racist ideas, the dual within racist thought. It kind of goes like this. If you expect, if white people expect a black person to become less black in order to be accepted, and the book is filled with examples of hairstyles and darkness of skin. The lightening cream industry is massive across the world, where dark-skinned people try to lighten their color of their skin. And he says, if somebody has to become like this group in order to be viewed as fully human, that is a racist idea. Mm-hmm. And right now, there are schools that send children home because of the style of their hair. So very interesting, not very interesting. In the book, there is the centrality of the notion of hierarchy. My group is above your group. And this is not in the book, but in my graduate study, we learned about Kenneth Burke, who believed that one of the motivations for human beings is that he or she is goaded by the spirit of hierarchy. I want to be higher up in the hierarchy. And so from the beginning, to make races, he believes that there's not enough biological difference between the races to talk about the races. But from the beginning, to make races was to make racial hierarchy. Turn to page 13. That is the central double standard in ethnic racism, loving one's position on the ladder above other ethnic groups and hating one's position below that of other ethnic groups. I'm not this high, but I'm not this low. I'm in the middle. So at least I'm better than these people, but I'm not as good as those people. That's hierarchy. Whoever makes the cultural standard makes the cultural hierarchy. The act of making a cultural standard and hierarchy is what creates cultural racism. Right in the margin there, this name, Don Imus. And we're going to come back to him in just a minute. About strategy, it all revolves around policy change. Individual behaviors can shape the success of individuals, but policies determine the success of groups. Thus, circle this, put a star beside this. This is big in his approach. The call is to be an activist. Changing minds is not a movement. Critiquing racism is not activism. Changing minds is not activism. An activist produces power, circle power, and policy change, not mental change. If a person has no record of power or policy change, then that person is not an activist. We use the terms demonstration and protest interchangeably at our own peril, like we interchangeably use the terms mobilizing and organizing. A protest is organizing people for a prolonged campaign that forces racist power to change a policy. A demonstration is mobilizing people momentarily to publicize a problem. So I'll use the example that is easiest to grasp. On December 1, 1955, Rosa Parks was arrested. The people gathered in the church building that night, and they decided they would not ride the city buses, the Montgomery bus boycott, until the law was changed that any person could sit anywhere on the bus on any ride. And they did not ride it for a year, more than a year. That was a protest to change policy. And so one of the issues facing us on the streets of America right now is a peaceful protest. Doesn't matter much unless it becomes a demonstration to change policy. Okay, I'm going to choose a few of these. We're going to go through them really quickly. Turn all the way back to page 2. Page 2. I hope that you will read these excerpts on your own. I'm going to just read a few of them. Number 8 on page 2. I've come to see that the movement from racist to anti-racist is always ongoing. It requires understanding and snubbing racism based on biology, ethnicity, body, culture, behavior, color, space, and class. Number 14, racist policies have been described by other terms: institutional racism, structural racism, systemic racism. Racist policy is more tangible and exacting, and more likely to be immediately understood by people, including its victims, who may not have the benefit of extensive fluency in racial terms. Institutional racism, structural racism, systemic racism are redundant. Racism itself is institutional, structural, and systemic. Focusing on racial discrimination takes our eyes off the central agents of racism, racist policy, and racist policy makers, or what I call racist power. All right? Look at page 3, number 21. White people are more likely than Black and Latinx people to sell drugs, and the races consume drugs at similar rates. Yet African Americans are far more likely than whites to be put in jail for drug offenses. That's a racist policy. Nonviolent Black drug offenders remain in prisons for about the same length of time as violent white criminals. Interesting. All right, I don't have time to read all of these that I want, so I'm going to hit a couple. Turn to page 5, number 48. This is really a good line. Black people are apparently responsible for calming the fears of violent cops in the way women are supposedly responsible for calming the sexual desires of male rapists. That's really quite a line. I want you to circle that and ponder it to see what it means. Okay, only one. Oh, no, we got to look at page 6, number 66. This is what Black children learned as a ditty while Kendi was growing up. If you're white, you're right. If you're yellow, you're mellow. If you're brown, stick around. If you're Black, get back. And the next quote, 67, in 2007, Don Imus on MSNBC compared Rutgers' dark-skinned, dark-colored basketball players, quote, "That's some nappy-headed hose there," to Tennessee's light players. They all look cute. There's the judgment based on skin color. I wish I had time to read all of these. I do have to read one more. Turn to page 10. This is history. And this will give you an idea of the background. Top of the page, number 103. For segregationists, like United States Senator Ben Pitchfork Tillman, former governor, senator from a southern state, President Theodore Roosevelt crossed the color line when he, Roosevelt, dined with Booker T. Washington in October of 1901. The action of President Roosevelt in entertaining that blank will necessitate our killing 1,000 blanks in the South before they will learn their place again. He was not joking. There's your background. Quote number 105, I just want to mention it in passing, is Kendi says that he learned his perspective from a book by Kwame Ture and Charles Hamilton, and I had forgotten this. Kwame Ture is the later name of Stokely Carmichael. So that's that. All right, turn to page 13, the last page. I planned to end at 1:30. I'm going to go to about 1:31. So what to do, right here. So what to do. This is his answer. It's all in italics. It's from the book. It's a comprehensive answer. Admit racial inequity is a problem of bad policy, not bad people. identify racial inequity in all its intersections and manifestations, investigate and uncover the racist policies causing racial inequity, invent or find anti-racist policy that can eliminate racial inequity, figure out who or what group has the power to institute anti-racist policy, disseminate and educate about the uncovered racist policy and anti-racist policy correctives, work with sympathetic anti-racist policymakers to institute the anti-racist policy, deploy anti-racist power to compel or drive from power the unsympathetic racist policymakers in order to institute anti-racist policy. Monitor closely to ensure the anti-racist policy does in fact reduce and eliminate racial inequity. When policies fail, do not blame the people, start over and seek out new and more effective anti-racist treatments until they work. Monitor closely to prevent new racist policies from being instituted. That's a very hefty paragraph. That's what he says to work on. Bottom of the page, 5 lessons and takeaways. Quit pretending that racism is not still a problem. It is. Number 2, maybe do some serious study. What you don't know is probably worth knowing and worth learning from the past and actually what's being done now. I did not know about Shingle Mountain until about a month ago. Number 3, maybe do some serious self-examination. What you don't know is probably how have you contributed to the racism in our society. If you're a non-racist, that means you've been silent when things have been done to harm people. Number 4, learn to separate your preference. I may like a certain kind of hairstyle from what is right and wrong. And number 5, maybe it is time to blank. And I left a blank there. I don't know what you want to put in it. March on Washington. Carry petitions to members of Congress. Whatever it is, it's got to change policy. How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. I hope you found this useful, and thanks for joining us at the Urban Engagement Book Club. I'm going to unmute everybody, and let's see. All right, I think you're on. I think.
Thank you so
maybe
much.
You're not. Hold on.
No, dear, I got myself on. I'm right here. So great to see everyone. Guys, can we give it up for Randy one more time? Fresh out of surgery, all is just as sharp as he wants to be. Randy, this book especially means so much to me, and to hear the which I believe were some of the most powerful segments. It's just a lot of good reading. And so, guys, just don't look at the PDF, even though Randy did a good chunk of the work. There are some hidden gems in there that you will miss if you don't read the book yourself. So I just want to thank you all for coming today. Again, Randy was amazing. You guys were amazing. And I know that there have been, I want to clarify 2 things before we go, actually 3. 1, it's still North Texas Giving Day. So give right now. I'm going to drop the link in the chat one more time before we leave today. The second thing, I want to address something that keeps happening with a couple of you. So some of you get all of the messages and you see them all and you know how to get into the Zoom. And then some of you, we have some problems with, you getting the email and not being able to see the Zoom link until the day of. So let me clarify how this goes so that just everyone can be on the same page. I send out at the beginning of the month an email to all book club members. When you re-engaged and sent your yes, I want to be in book club email, we got your email. I took it, I put it in a get an email at the beginning of every month. You RSVP from that link. In that link, when you RSVP on the very first page, once you sign the first page, the Zoom link is there. You also get the Zoom link in the response email that you should get saying that thank you for RSVPing, here is the Zoom link. And just in case you miss both of those, which that happens to me too. So just in case you miss both of those, on the day of book club, I will email you exactly 1 hour before book club. Actually, it's an hour and a half. It's at 11 a.m., the day of book club. I will email you again 2 things, the Zoom link, and then by then Randy has sent me the PDF file. And so you will get that. And so I just want to clarify it again to everyone. We hear you guys. I see you. I know some of you have it all the time and some of you don't. So I just want to clarify to everyone how that goes. So you're going to get the initial Zoom link in the RSVP. And then it's again in your email RSVP. So don't delete that email. And just in case you don't have it then, you're going to get it the day of at 11 a.m. straight to your email from me personally. Yes? Thumbs up for me. Thumbs up.
Thanks, Aja.
Okay, fantastic. So then we will see you guys next week. And again, I'm so excited to see everybody. North Texas Giving Day, give a donation today. And if you want your donation matched, if we haven't already passed the donation match, you have to at least give $25. And I feel like for 12 months of programming, just $25, you can't beat that deal anywhere. That's better than Spotify. It's better than Netflix. So I want to thank you guys for coming. I hope that you have a great day. And thanks, Randy. Thanks, everybody.
I'm going to stay on for a while if people want to chat. Let me mention 2 things. One, next month, the book is Made, Hard Work, Low Pay, and a Mother's Will to Survive. And so it's a kind of in the genre of what was Barbara Ehrenreich's famous book, I'm drawing a blank.
Nickel and dime.
Nickel and dime, on not getting by in America. So we'll do that on that month. And then I'm going to present this same book that I did today in a shorter version at First Friday Book Synopsis on October 2nd, along with a business book. So if you know people who missed it today, that's my last time to do a social justice book at the First Friday Book Synopsis. Okay, it's opening up for conversation for a few minutes. Who wants to go first? Make sure you're unmuted.
I will.
Okay.
Kendi has, I put it in the chat, but Kendi has a workbook, journal, whatever that you can use, I guess, for your own notes that's coming out in October.
Okay.
And called, again, the same title with journal, I think. That's the end of it. Oh, it's called Be Anti-Racist.
Be Anti-Racist, okay.
A journal for awareness, reflection, and action.
Okay, thanks, Dawn.
Sure.
All right, who else? How did you feel about this book?
Incredible. I have been part of some protests, well, I guess demonstrations, and it's good to know the difference. Of course, now with COVID, it's terrifying to want to get out and march with anybody. So I'm making donations, but during a pandemic, it's like you can't physically get in anybody's face. So
yeah,
I'm not sure how much power, you can show.
Well, and this book really helped me understand that just marching without policy change does not make the level of difference that it needs to make. So
I heard that loud and clear.
That's really interesting.
Yes, it is.
Thanks, Shelley.
I do think it's interesting that the research, which is all very new, is that the protests do not seem to be super spreaders of the virus. Indoor activity without masks does.
Yeah.
A church, but that the protests don't seem to be, because again, most of the time people are masked and they're outside. And, you know, one of the things that, I mean, you know, thank you, Randy. Some of us have been reading these books for a number of years, but protest demonstrations, whatever you want to call them, bring people's attention to suddenly start talking about this in ways they never have before. So it's all, I think, little pieces of the puzzle to finally get to policy change.
Yeah.
It has to start with conversations.
And I do agree with that, but it can't end with conversation.
Right.
That's what I'm learning strongly in this book, especially. Yeah. It does help to raise the consciousness, to use the old feminism formula, but you then have to do something after you raise the consciousness. So somebody else.
Randy?
Yes. Hi, Susan.
Hi. As we were going through this today, I was thinking about my falling short in, I do a lot of reading and a lot of studying, and I do a lot of talking with other people, and I even, you know, there are forums at our church where we do a lot of, you know, looking at history that none of us knew or we forgot, or all of those things. And yet right now we've got, you know, Dallas budget, where we're trying to look at, you know, what to do about the police budget, which is just right. You know, that's, you know, talking about the policy. And I didn't do, you know, very much in that regard. I mean, I made a couple of phone calls, but there were more things I could have done. And so I really appreciate, this is like a nudge, you know, particularly at the end, what to do.
Yeah.
You know, it's not all about the education and the learning, you know, it's about what to do after that happens. And I think I've been a little stuck in that.
One of the things, Susan, that I got out of this book, it was a better understanding of why, and I'm going to be blunt here, why some African-American police officers seem to be especially hard on African-Americans. And that was difficult for me to grasp. And it reminded me of the people during the Holocaust in the camps, where a Jewish person might kind of work alongside the Nazi guards. And what this book really argues is that in one sense, self-interest leads people to want to rise up the hierarchy, even if it means, in the African-American circle, turning them racist against fellow Black people. And that, you know, I have a rule. I don't think that a white guy should tell a Black person how they ought to feel. I just don't think that's true. I don't think a white guy who's raised Protestant should ever tell a Jewish person how they should feel. One of the things I work hard on is vocabulary. And right now, there's a major article that's just come out that says Hispanic and Latino people do not like the word Latinx. And so now I got to work on what word to use. But I just believe that we cannot impose our views on anybody. But this book helped me understand that piece of it in a little bit better way. So somebody else.
There's an interesting billboard, as I noticed this morning. It's a scary looking billboard, and it says, "No police, no peace," with a very militarized police officer staring at you.
And how do you interpret that?
Scary.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, it's on 30 just coming into downtown, and it's aggressive.
Yeah.
To me.
Yeah.
And I do think it's racist. It's obviously racist intent.
Yeah. We really are so incredibly divided at the moment about all of this, about the proper role of the police, and it's difficult to process. But you know, to take one example, the horrible ambush shooting of the two deputies, sheriff deputies in Los Angeles, that was ghastly. And one of the first persons to issue a statement was Joe Biden condemning it. So it is a mistake to think that he does not believe in protecting police officers. And so anyway, I'm getting into politics. I apologize.